This month marks the 10th anniversary of the coming into force of the Equality Act 2010, a landmark piece of legislation that dramatically reformed and improved the laws on equality in the UK. Last month, to mark this anniversary, the National Secular Society released a report that examined the exemptions which religious organisations have succeeded in carving out of the Equality Act for themselves. It also looked at the negative consequences of these exemptions in the areas of employment, education and caste discrimination. In this podcast, I will be speaking to Baroness Lynn Featherstone, a Liberal Democrat peer, champion of equality legislation, and former Minister with responsibility for equality in the Coalition Government. Lynn will be discussing her experiences of getting the Equality Bill through Parliament, the opposition she encountered from religious groups, and the ongoing problems today caused by religious exemptions to the Act. I will then be joined by Megan Manson to give the NSS's perspective. Lynn Featherstone, you were an MP during the passage of the Equality Act 2010, and as a Home Office Minister and as Undersecretary for Equalities under Theresa May when she was Minister for Equalities, you helped to take the enabling legislation through Parliament. Did the Equality Act feel like a landmark at the time?
Yes, it did. I suppose it was the bringing together of 40 years of equality legislation that was confusing everybody and not working that well. And I thought it was a huge step forward, which obviously it happened under the Labour government before we became the coalition. And I led for the Liberal Democrats during its passage. And it brought together, it was 35 acts, 52 statutory instruments, 13 codes of practice, 16 EU directives, and they weren't working. So it was a landmark piece of legislation that brought it together. And it pinpointed things, if you look at something like equal pay, we clearly hadn't got equal pay then, we still don't have equal pay now, but it attempted to bring together those things and to enhance equality. It wasn't just the bringing together of all this disparate legislation. So, there are so many examples, but I think one of its landmark qualities was the public sector equality duty and the creation of protected characteristics. And those protected characteristics were age, disability, gender reassignment. I had many, many arguments in committee about the word reassignment because I felt it meant you had to have an operation before someone recognised that you needed a different sort of protection for gender identity. It also included marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. And I suppose even way back then, I didn't really feel that religion and belief should be a protected characteristic, but that's a whole other argument. So it was landmark, and it was the culmination of all the years of fighting and trying to bring some sense of ending discrimination in all its forms, whatever the characteristic you had.
The list of protected characteristics, so it was a product of the committee then?
No, the list of protected characteristics was part of the legislation brought forward by the then Labour government. I remember at the time, and speaking in the second reading debate when I led for the Lib Dems, I think it was 2009, that religion and belief should not actually be a protected characteristic because it would lead to the entrenchment of discrimination.
When you were in government in the coalition and working with Theresa May, were you on the same side about most of the equalities issues then?
On and off. Yes, I would say that Theresa May was basically determined to enact the bill. One of the biggest differentials we had was actually not on religion and belief. It was on pay audits, on women's pay. But time moves on in politics and your positions change and you don't always get what you want.
Let's talk a bit more about religion and belief. Now, when you and others were bringing the new bill before Parliament, who were the people who wanted religion and belief, A, to be a protected characteristic, and then B, later to have special exemptions in relation to religious organisations?
Well, basically the organised great religions of the world, but in particular the Church of England and the Catholic religion. They were very fierce about, also Muslims and Orthodox Jews, but they wanted exemptions so that they could continue to discriminate in terms of who they employed, for example. And they felt that the new act reduced their ability to discriminate. And when I say discriminate, that would be something like if a Catholic school wanted to employ a caretaker, they would like it to be a Catholic caretaker. Whereas obviously in the provision of goods and services, as was included in the Act, actually there was nothing about caretaking that you needed to be a Catholic. Obviously, it was understood that if you were going to be a priest, you needed to be a Catholic if you were proselytizing. But if there was a job, say a youth worker, or as I say, a caretaker, then they didn't need. However, that was a very, very fierce fight, and they won.
And how come they won?
Just because an exemption was there that allowed them to say, for example, with a youth worker, that a youth worker was teaching and therefore it was proselytizing and therefore they should be able to discriminate and only have a Catholic youth worker working with Catholic youths.
Outside education, what were the other major exemptions that the major religions obtained to the Equality Act?
Schools were exempted so that religious schools could be set up without breaching the Act. Funnily enough, what the National Secular Society is putting forward, quite rightly in my view, is to change that law so that state-funded religious schools, including the Church of England, will no longer be able to promote the interests of their religious body above the education and welfare of their pupils. Then there were two schedules in the Equality Act which were there to stop any conflict with earlier laws that impose basically Christian worship in all state schools, including non-religious ones. And again, I agree with the National Secular Society and removing the imposition of collective worship in schools. I remember, for example, that at my primary school, there were 7 Jewish children who had to sit in the library during prayers in the morning, and it made them different. In fact, I was one of them, and it's probably why at the age of 7, I told my parents I wasn't going to be Jewish anymore, because I felt so alienated and different. And I think that's what collective worship does. Other parts of the Act made exceptions to allow the existence of religious schools. And lastly, on education, there are 2 schedules that allow schools to discriminate on religious grounds for entry into that school. And I can't remember which were added and which were carried forward, but either way, the Act needs changing so that you should not be able to discriminate in terms of on religious grounds for entry into that school. And although there's been lots of accommodations where you're allowed X percentage here and X percentage there, the practice is harmful.
Do you think that the public are generally aware of the importance of the Equality Act and what it can and can't do?
Well, I'm certain they're not aware of the detail of the Act. I mean, it's a very long and a very complicated Act. But I think, just as with the human rights laws, people seem to, because of the way of its discourse in the public space has become about human rights as sort of as an excuse for anything, as it is with the Equality Act, people seem to think it's to be used officially, for people to take people to tribunals endlessly on tiny points, and not realizing that it's actually holding people's rights to live their lives freely. I mean, of course it gets abused on both sides, but I think the public don't have a real concept of what this protection has done. The other side of legislation is often it advances equality in this Act by the message it sends out, that equality is something that gives you rights, that you cannot discriminate, and so on and so forth. And how that becomes part of our nation seeps into it, but it's not often propagated by some of our media.
Do you think the media are at fault for misrepresenting the Equality Act?
Well, I can't point to specific details, but yes, I think the media are often at fault in using as a highlight something that is the truth, but misusing it as if everything depends in that specific way. But it was an incredibly important piece of legislation to stop the sort of thing that I grew up with when I first went to work and was sacked from my first job for not sleeping with one of the directors.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, the existence of the Me Too movement in recent years, does that suggest that the Equality Act didn't go far enough in protecting women against sexual harassment in the workplace?
Yes, and I think that's very classic in as much as legislation gives you the laws to protect you, but getting to the point of court and getting it to be taken seriously is a whole other thing where society has to shift. But you do see societal shift when laws are made, eventually. If you think about the drink driving laws, when, everyone used to drink and drive when I was at college, not me, obviously, but eventually society saw, because the law was there, that it was terrible. People were being irresponsible and killing other people. Same with wearing a seatbelt, that was resented. Same with the laws around LGB issues. But gradually, once the law was in place and society shifted, and occasionally it's the other way around, because I was the architect and originator of the same-sex marriage law, which encountered a lot of the religious resistance, the same as the Equality Act. In that case, the people were ahead of the politicians, but because in a way the religious fraternity is so strong in our country, it took a long time for it to get into law, but now it is the law. No one blinks an eyelid.
That's a very interesting point you make about religious resistance also to the same-sex marriage bill. How do the major religions influence legislation in Parliament?
Well, the key points of influence in Parliament are the fact that this is the Queen is head of the Church of England, and the religions have always had a very powerful voice in Parliament through the parties, but also bishops sit in the House of Lords as of by right. But their organisations are profoundly respected, and rightly so, when they have, in my view, an undue influence and have had for many years.
Would you say that they're equally influential on all MPs in all parties, or would you say some parties are more liable to be influenced by religious figures than others?
Well, of course, the Conservative Party has always had a very, very close relationship with the Church of England in particular. I think everyone listens with respect to the religious argument, but someone like myself believes that religions deserve freedom, respect, freedom to practice. But there are so many parts of the religious doctrine that cross with secular life or with non-discrimination, whether it's around homosexuality or educating children or those sorts of things.
Is it also the case that it's one thing to allow people to express their religious belief and another thing to say that their religious beliefs should be allowed to influence what other people who don't share them can do?
Yes, of course it is. I mean, I'm a live and let live liberal, and I really don't see that you should seek to influence beyond your religion. And I have never understood. I mean, there were just huge issues around schools, in I think it was in Birmingham was the most recent example when sex and relationship lessons were to be taught. And there was a huge outcry. But I've never understood why parents cannot say to their children, if their religion believes that homosexuality, for example, is a sin, because that's one that keeps coming up and up over the years, why a religious family would not say to their child, we believe this is a sin, other people think other things, and we must respect everybody, and have faith in their own religious tenets to be strong enough to guide their children the way they hope they will be guided. But it shouldn't be something that stops people from knowing. Religion isn't about stopping people knowing about things, but They are strong fighters. And as I say, during the same-sex marriage passage of that, the great religions of the world, fought tooth and nail for it not to happen. They believed it would undermine marriage. Of course, it does no such thing. It shows how valuable marriage is for everybody.
One particular issue that's continued since 2010 was caste discrimination. Now, the Equality Act introduced the power for a minister to say that caste should be included on the list of protected characteristics and thereby outlaw caste discrimination. Now, the present government have committed to actually removing this protection from the Act. What's your view about caste discrimination?
Caste was a huge issue during the passage of the Equality Bill, and I was lobbied intensely from both sides of the issue. But to me, the caste system is discrimination. That is its fundamental character. And of course, like all the religions that have come to the United Kingdom, because we are still a tolerant and free country, imported with different waves of immigration has been the caste system. It came with it. And I was a minister in the Department for International Development for 2 years. And I saw caste and its practice and the horror of the status of lower caste, despised and mistreated. And it is intensely still felt. And I remember the arguments about how I was interfering in a system that had been there and it worked very well and it meant that's the order of things, but it is totally against equality. It is fundamentally against equality, and it is and should be a crime to discriminate on the grounds of caste.
Now, the NSS has recently released a report just in September 2020 about how religious privilege in many different ways continues to undermine equality law even today. And the name of that report is Faith-Shaped Holes, How Religious Privilege is Undermining Equality Law. You, Lynn, wrote the foreword to this report. What were your reasons for doing so?
Well, firstly, they invited me to do so. But it is a passion that I have as a liberal. I believe live and let live should be the basis on which we conduct ourselves in this world. I also feel that many of the problems of the world stem from religion. You know, growing up, I understood it was a force that was supposedly about love and forgiveness and charity and kindness. And then when I grew up, I found it was also the basis of war, deprivation, unfairness, and guilt. And so it seems to me that when it comes to issues such as abortion, alcohol, homosexuality, employment, sex education, the great organized religions of our world want to have the benefit of our phenomenal equality laws, so long as they don't have to comply with anything they don't subscribe to.
So they want to have their cake and eat it.
They definitely do want to have their cake and eat it. And, as I said, during the passage of the same-sex marriage bill, I was often the target of death threats and disparaging attacks from the religious orders. And my response to those who so violently attacked me and the legislation, and who were often the heads of the great organized religions of our world, was to use the words advised to me by Stonewall, which were my very strong advice to those who do not agree with same-sex marriage, is not to marry someone of the same sex.
Yeah, that sounds like a good response.
And I would say the same in terms of the issues raised in the National Secular Society report. Don't hide your children from knowledge. You tell them you're their parents, and if they agree with you, they'll follow you. And in this country where we live and hope to live in harmony with each other, whatever our belief system, whatever our particular protected characteristics, and some of us have lots of them, everyone is equal and should be treated equally in all sorts of ways.
A key principle of secularism in particular is that any form of unfair religious privilege should not undermine the rights and freedoms of others. So this is always a question about balancing everyone's right to freedom of religion and belief against the possibility that some people may exploit their position to unfairly affect others. Now, as far as the NSS report is concerned, the three main ways which it identified there's still a problem with the current equality legislation are in terms of caste-based discrimination, which we've talked about, education, which you mentioned briefly, faith schools, and also employment. For you, what are still the biggest issues in these areas which need further reform?
I do think that some of the exemptions that were in the Equality Act need reform, because the religions, I fear, are misusing them to only employ people of that particular faith within their circle. So that is one thing that needs reforming. Another is, I really don't think that collective worship should be something in schools. I just don't think so. I think it is better for schools to have a morning assembly talking about life in general, or the news, or what's going on in school. I don't think it should be any form of religious worship, because as I described from my own experience as a child, you don't want to alienate any group, to feel one group is the main group or the more important group, or that your group doesn't matter. You're foisted off to the library while others have assembly. So I think it's very important to remove collective worship from schools.
Would this be an argument for getting rid of faith-based state schools altogether?
This goes beyond what the National Secular Society are suggesting, or indeed what the Liberal Democrats, of which I am a member, have as policy. But on a personal capacity, I would love there to be that schools are about education and home is about religion and faith. I don't think schools are the appropriate place for it, but that's not where this report is going at this point. It's trying to remove some of the very overt examples of where the exemptions to the Equality Act have enabled religious exceptionalism. But my view is that anything that is state funded should not really include religion of any sort. It should certainly teach all religions in religious instruction class, or religious education rather, not instruction class. If you look at what separateness does, it creates alienation and mistrust or superiority. As I said, I worked in Africa for nearly 2 years when I was DFID minister, and I did spend part of every week mostly in Africa. And what I learned there, what I saw there, that any difference, state-sponsored, either through power or status or whatever, caused dispute and unhappiness, whether it was tribal, religious, ethnicity. It didn't matter what the difference was. The minute you entrench it in some form of privilege for state sanctions, it causes wars, jealousy, one-upmanship. It doesn't, it just is not harmonious. And, it's not that long ago since the troubles in Northern Ireland finally came to a blessed, excuse the expression, stop.
So the whole point of the Equality Act, as far as you're concerned, is just to give the best chance for people of every single belief or no belief to flourish and to work together.
I do believe that is it. I also think it is to stop the harms that are so in our base human nature that actually make us discriminate. And it's to help us stop being discriminatory, because it is now against the law.
As you say, we can see in many different societies throughout history, if the laws encourage a certain form of behaviour, then society goes in that direction. So if they encourage a more discriminatory form of behaviour, then people will perhaps feel like it's more normal. Whereas if they encourage a greater tolerance, then it may help push society in a more tolerant direction.
We live in hope that is what happens, because you can see what happens when it goes the wrong way. So I think it is very important. I think the Equality Act reminds us of our humanity towards each other.
Finally, then, what are the immediate practical steps you think that need to be taken to get the inequalities that we've been discussing?
We need some new laws that will, at this stage, in terms of what the National Secular Society is wanting, will deliver legislatively the changes that remove the exemptions that enable the entrenchment of religious privilege.
Lynn Featherstone, thank you very much. I'm joined now by Megan Manson from the National Secular Society, and she's going to give a comment on my interview with Baroness Lynn Featherstone, in particular to talk about what the NSS's position is on unfair religious exceptionalism, the current state of equality law, and what needs to change. Megan, to start with, talking about the NSS report, which just recently came out about the issue of religious exceptions in equality law, could you just clarify what are the main things that the report said about what needs to change in the current state of the law?
So for this report, what we wanted to do was to explore where these, as we call them, faith-shaped holes are in the Equality Act 2010. So religion or belief is a protected characteristic. So in theory, everyone should be protected by that, because belief does include, quite specifically, non-religious belief. So we basically did a deep dive into the Equality Act and looked for where there are religious exemptions. There are lots of exemptions in the Equality Act. Some are justified, but many others are not. And what we wanted to do was look for those religious exemptions that were potentially causing problems. And we found three areas where it seemed the most egregious, which were in education, regarding caste-based discrimination, and discrimination in employment. So what we did was we actually looked and found the specific part of the law that does this. I think that this is the first report of its kind to really do that, to really look at the mechanisms behind what causes these exemptions. And with regards to education, there were multiple exemptions. So as we've heard from Lynn Featherstone, collective worship and discrimination in school admissions is all enabled by exemptions of the Equality Act. These exemptions enable schools to deliver an exclusive faith-based curriculum. They allow them to discriminate against staff in employment. They even allow local authorities to apply discriminatory criteria in their policies for school transport. So basically, a local authority can provide free transport to somebody who is attending a faith school. And then for caste, it doesn't have a particular characteristic, although many were arguing during the formation of the Equality Act that it should. There isn't an uncommenced duty within the Equality Act to make caste an explicit aspect of race discrimination as soon as practical. However, more recently, the government sort of decided it wasn't going to do that, and the Parliamentary Under-Secretary for the Ministry of Equalities, Kemi Badenoch, has confirmed that basically they want to take caste out completely. So essentially, there is nothing there protecting people who are vulnerable to this particular form of discrimination.
So in terms of employment is, of course, another issue which was also raised by Lynn Featherstone. I mean, do you have anything to add in terms of what the NSS discovered about how religious exemptions affect employment?
With employment, you have what's called genuine occupational requirements that do allow you to essentially discriminate on according to particular protected characteristics if you need to. There's lots of times where you might need to do this. And with religion or belief discrimination, there are some legitimate times. So, for example, I think it's utterly reasonable to specify that if you want to be a vicar, that you have to be a Christian. If you want to be a pastor, you have to be a Christian. But looking at the official explanatory notes, it looks like that this exemption, the genuine occupational requirement exemptions, are only meant to cover a very narrow range of employment when it comes to religion. But we think that it's being applied a lot more broadly to that, and it's being misused and being used by religious employers essentially to only have a workforce of one religion when there's really no justification for it.
That seems like quite an abuse of the system then, potentially.
Yeah, I think so, yes. We really want to see that looked into and to basically clarify, say, well, when can you do this? Because I think at the moment it's being overused.
In terms of religious exceptionalism and unfair privilege, which is still in equality law or inherently in the system at the moment, do you have any particular concrete examples of how this affects people?
Well, one of the things we wanted to demonstrate in our report is that this isn't just theoretical, this is real. And that's why we included quite a few case studies throughout the report. In the education section, we have some testimonials from parents and pupils and from teachers and governors as well who've experienced this. Naturally, we found that people who are non-religious tend to bear the brunt of these problems, and very often it's people who are already marginalised and who are especially affected by religious discrimination. So for example, single mums, because they can't attend church services every week in order to ensure that their child gets to go into the local school. Those are on lower wages, and LGBT people as well. So it's basically that if you're already marginalised, then in terms of equality, the Equality Act, it's not really doing its job for you.
So it's failing to protect the people who ought to be protected.
Exactly. So yeah, we found this all out from signatures and from our online petitions. We didn't actually sort of look specifically for this report. It's people who've been coming to us and telling us these stories and signing these petitions for a long time. And all we needed to do was look through those, and we could find plenty of testimonials from people. For example, pupils being punished for not participating in collective worship. Parents who find that their people can't enter their local school because they don't go to church. Just lots and lots of studies like that. There was one particular case study that we put in that is particularly chilling because it involved a school that isn't a faith school, and that's Burford Primary School, which is a community school, so it doesn't have a designated religious character. And we heard from two parents who'd enrolled their children at that school because it was community-based, because it didn't have a religious character. That's why they wanted that. And then the school joined a Church of England Academy Trust, and things started to change. The parents heard that their children were attending assemblies held by the church, all the children were encouraged to pray, Christianity was positioned as the truth, and children were acting out Bible stories. So the parents decided to raise this with the school, and the school said, well, we're acting within the law. It says right here we could have collective worship. And in a way, the school's right. You don't necessarily have to be a faith school in order to religiously discriminate against children.
Lynn Featherstone was talking about her experience of the extent to which the Church of England and the Catholic Church in particular influenced legislation through Parliament. In your view, why is religious influence in general, particularly Christianity, but also other religions, still so entrenched in British society in the 21st century, even though about half of the population is probably non-religious?
Lots of it comes to being having historic privilege. The Church of England is the established church. The Catholic Church as well has had a very influential presence in the UK for a long time. And because of the wealth and the power and the status that they've built up, they have this legacy, which makes them a very powerful lobbying force. And we did see, when researching for this report, we found that lots of religious groups were involved and consulted during the process. So it really showed the extent to which they were the reason why these exemptions exist. So essentially, I think what we were seeing here was institutions that are already privileged trying to maintain the status quo and trying to keep that privilege.
Did you get a sense for the extent to which other religions that are represented in Britain, such as Islam and Judaism, also are enabled, partly through the influence of the C of E, to maintain their own privileges?
I think that that the Church of England, because it is the established church, is sort of able to hold the door open for other groups. So, if you just gave privilege to the Church of England, other religious groups will say, well, hang on, what about us? Surely if you're giving it to one religion, you should be giving it to us too. And politically, it often is easier to do this. It's much easier to just say yes to these groups, say, okay, well, rather than tackle the harder problem, which is saying, well, actually, these religious groups shouldn't have the privilege in the first place. They've got an advantage, and they're they've got privilege that the non-religious don't have.
Is there anyone to represent the non-religious in the way that religious organisations represent the religious?
Well, the things with the non-religious is they are sort of, by definition, they kind of have their own identity. They don't necessarily form groups. I mean, obviously, there are groups like Humanist UK, but I'd say the vast majority of non-religious people don't actively identify as humanists. A lot of non-religious people, they're just sort of religiously indifferent. They're not necessarily atheist. It's just religion isn't really part of their thoughts. It's not part of their life. So they don't really feel a need to be in a particular group, which of course has the disadvantage that it is much harder to lobby with the same way that religious groups can. The National Secular Society does try to elevate the voice of those people. And essentially, we're about achieving equality for all.
Looking at the issues which the NSS report has highlighted about the continuing existence of unfair religious privilege supported by equality legislation, what are the next steps? What does the NSS want to happen next?
Well, what we'd like to do is draw the attention of ministers and parliamentarians to this report, and to see these recommendations seriously considered and enacted. We really want to see the religious exemptions for education repealed, and the laws that they sort of are based around repealed as well, so a repealing of the law requiring collective worship. We want to see caste included as its own protected characteristic, so not as an aspect of race, because we think that caste is something quite separate to race. So we want that to be its own protected characteristic. And we want to see the exemptions that allow discrimination if there's a genuine occupation requirement revisited, and see some scrutiny on the organisations that are applying them to make sure that they're doing it in a fair way.
What can members do if they want to support the NSS?
Well, we really do encourage all our supporters to read the report and to alert their MP to it. So you can do that really easily from our website. There's a function that you can use to send a pre-written editable letter to your MP. And also, please do come to us and let us know your experiences. If you think that, if you've read the report and think, oh yes, I've experienced that as well, please do tell us. It's really helpful to know what people's experiences are, and it can help to make things fairer further down the line.
Megan Manson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This episode was produced by the National Secular Society, all rights reserved. The views expressed by contributors do not necessarily represent those of the NSS. You can access the show notes and subscriber information for this and all our episodes at secularism.org.uk/podcast. For feedback, comments and suggestions, please email podcast@secularism.org.uk. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you can. Thanks for listening, and I hope you can join us next time.